In this video, I'm going to be teaching you why lifting to failure could be hurting your strength and hypertrophy gains. Hi, my name is Dr. Joe Camerato. I'm with Across The Continuum, and my goal is to make you a better strength coach as a physical therapist. Now, we need to first go over what proximity to failure is. Proximity to failure is defined as the number of repetitions remaining in a set prior to what's called momentary muscular failure. Momentary muscular failure is basically when the individual can't complete a full rep, a full concentric portion of the rep without form breaking down, and form being defined as whatever the coach or whoever is watching defines it as. This idea of proximity to failure might sound familiar if you've been up to date with the other videos that I've put out on things like subjective intensity and RPE. For those of you who haven't seen those videos, RPE stands for rate of perceived exertion. All that is a subjective rating from the lifter on how difficult or how close to failure they feel with a certain exercise, a certain amount of weight, and a certain number of reps. RPE relates back to proximity to failure because the higher the rating of perceived exertion, the closer to failure the lifter feels like they are. If you want to avoid failing as a strength forward therapist, go ahead and subscribe to my channel for more information like this. So why even think about proximity to failure to begin with? The reason that you should care about proximity to failure is because it has an influence on both hypertrophy and strength training. Those influences involve the amount of volume that you're doing, the amount of muscle activation that come with getting closer to failure, and the more mechanical tension that is put on the muscle fibers while you're lifting. All of these are things that we think about when we think of hypertrophy and strength. Let's go over why maxing out proximity to failure probably isn't a good idea. Lots of new lifters, including myself back in the day, had this idea that we needed to absolutely max out proximity to failure or get really close to, if not all the way to failure in the gym to make the most gains possible. It also almost served as a signal to other lifters in the gym that we were working really hard and getting after it. Now that we have more information about proximity to failure, like the two papers that I'm going to be talking about today, we know that there are some downsides to going all the way to failure that don't necessarily communicate any benefit to the everyday lifting session. The question really here is the juice worth the squeeze? So the downsides that come with going all the way to momentary muscular failure are a couple things. First, there's a non-linear accumulation of neuromuscular fatigue that comes with those last few reps in a set before momentary muscular failure. And if you've ever taken a lift to failure, you know what the term smoked means. You have an inability to produce the same amount of force as you did prior to getting smoked, and it doesn't really go away very quickly. Not only that, but this is much more pronounced in high skill or complex movements like the snatch, the clean and jerk, the squat, the deadlift. These are just highly fatiguing movements when taken all the way to momentary muscular failure. Second, there is an increase of muscle discomfort and muscle damage. Now, this may hamper your ability to produce muscle force as well as participate in subsequent resistance training and recover from the resistance training that you do take to failure. Now, I know that muscle damage is something that lifters gravitate towards in the idea that they're going to damage their muscles, and the more that they damage their muscles, the more that they're going to build back up. Now, there is an inflection point where if there's too much delayed onset muscle soreness or too much muscle damage, the body has to shuttle energy away from that anabolic stimulus or that stimulus of building the muscle up to put fires out that are involved with that muscle damage and delayed onset muscle soreness. We see this mainly in folks that go really hard with novel or new stimuli and get a whole lot of soreness and a whole lot of delayed onset muscle soreness from that. Both of these phenomena hamper the muscle fiber contractility for not only that session, but subsequent resistance training sessions as well. So while you are lifting hard in that single session, you have an inability to perform that same level for these sessions in the remainder of the week or for a few days after that session. So what should you do instead when it comes to proximity to failure? Let's talk about how hard you should go. In short, we're not really sure, but we know it's not all the way to failure. In both of the papers that I've been referencing in this video, there is a gray area when it comes to optimal as far as how close to failure you should be lifting. These two graphs show that there is an inflection point around RPE 6 to 8, where things are still difficult enough, but not so difficult as to bring on those negative consequences. The idea here is that without that neuromuscular fatigue, without that muscle damage, and without that muscle discomfort, you can accumulate more volume and produce more force on your muscles than you would if you went to failure. And remember that a few of the important determinants of muscle hypertrophy and strength are volume, mechanical tension, and the muscle activity or activation that occurs during those sets. When is it a good idea to go to failure? I know I spent the whole video demonizing going to failure and saying that you probably shouldn't do it, but there are a few scenarios where it is either a good idea or you can do it without really worrying about it. One of the scenarios where it's a good idea is when we have to think about specific adaptations to impose demands, or the SAID principle. If you're a competitive strength athlete, whether that's powerlifting, weightlifting, strongman, CrossFit, there are certain scenarios where you have to go very close to failure, if not to failure, on certain lifts. We know that in those strength sports, you have the possibility and are probably going to be exposed to extremely high loads for you, and ones that are very close to failure. To build skill in those specific scenarios, you have to expose yourself to them in training. In this scenario, there's really no avoiding working really close to failure. Now, it doesn't have to be the entirety of your training, but touching on that really close proximity to failure is going to be important. Outside of that, the authors of these papers do make a few recommendations for when it's probably okay to go to failure. Number one, if the loads are lower or under 50% of a 1 rep max, it's probably okay to work with that. Number two, if the movements are lower in complexity, like single joint movements or when you're using a machine. Number three, if you're on the last set of a certain movement or a certain muscle group. And then number four, it's preferable if you go to failure as a resistance trained individual versus as an untrained individual. To wrap things up, proximity to failure is how close to momentary muscular failure are you with a certain lift. Things to remember are that you don't need to go all the way to failure to reap similar benefits when it comes to hypertrophy and strength. You can do more volume, more lifts, and more sessions within a week if you avoid going to failure, because you'll be more refreshed and more able to produce force or manage or handle all that extra volume. Now, that extra volume is going to accumulate and compound to push strength and hypertrophy forward. If you are a strength athlete and you need to build skill when it comes to managing heavy loads at failure or close to failure, then it's probably a good idea to do these close to failure bouts on a regular basis. Now, as always, if you found this video helpful, share it with other physical therapists and other coworkers, and let me know what you think in the comments, or if there's anything that you want me to touch on in these videos that I haven't talked about yet. Let me know down in the comments what you thought, and as always, have a great day.